That bracelet doesn't belong to you. The words cut through the elegant dinner party like a razor-sharp whisper. Grace Vitti, the matriarch of the Vitti family, stood at the center of the room, her voice trembling with emotion as her eyes locked onto the young maid serving hors d'oeuvres. The sparkling crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim as the weight of her words sank into the atmosphere. All eyes turned to Lisa Staton, the quiet, unassuming maid, who was trying to disappear into the shadows of the opulent Vitti estate. Grace's sharp gaze focused on the bracelet around Lisa's wrist, an ordinary piece of jewelry that held a much more profound meaning than Lisa could ever understand. Lisa Staton, a 27-year-old maid at the prestigious Vitti estate, had always felt like an invisible presence in the grand halls. The Vitti family was one of the most powerful Mafia families in the region, their wealth and influence undeniable. Tonight, the estate was filled with guests of unimaginable power, business moguls, politicians, and notorious figures from the underworld, all gathered for a lavish dinner hosted by Vincente Vitti, the feared Mafia boss. Lisa, too accustomed to being overlooked, moved gracefully through the crowd, serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres with practiced ease. In her crisp uniform and soft-soled shoes, she felt the stark contrast between herself and the glamorous guests around her. The gold and diamonds on display seemed a far cry from the thrifted clothing she had grown up with. The Vitti family's lifestyle was a world she could only observe from the periphery, never fully part of it, just a shadow in the background. However, tonight was about a shadow that carefully maintained invisibility. Vincente Vitti stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. His sharp eyes missed nothing, scanning the guests with the practiced vigilance of a man who had built his empire on power, fear, and ruthlessness. But beside him, in the shadows, was Grace Vitti, his mother, and the quiet force behind the Vitti family's legacy. Grace was elegant, poised, and seemingly untouched by time. At 60+, her sharp eyes never missed a detail, and her presence was one of quiet authority. Despite her age, there was a coldness in her gaze that no one dared challenge. Tonight, the Vitti family was preparing for another strategic move in their game of power and control, but that game was about to change. Lisa, trying her best to stay out of the way, moved among the guests with a tray of champagne. She had been working for the Vitti family for months now, and though she'd gotten used to their intimidating power, she'd never grown comfortable with it. Tonight, however, was different. Lisa wore a bracelet she'd found years ago in a thrift store, a small silver bangle that had become one of her few cherished belongings. It was a reminder of her late mother, someone she barely remembered, but whose spirit she carried with her. The bracelet was a quiet piece of her past, one she thought no one would ever notice. But Grace noticed. As Lisa moved past her, Grace's eyes fixed on the bracelet. She stiffened, a wave of shock passing over her usually composed features. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "That bracelet doesn't belong." The room fell eerily silent. Lisa froze. Grace's gaze locked on the piece of jewelry, as if she'd seen it 1,000 times before, but the recognition was met with an unsettling tremor in her hand. The guests shifted uncomfortably as Grace's hand shook, her breath quickening. "It's Isabella's," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an unspeakable history. "That bracelet was my daughter's." The air in the room thickened. Grace's sudden outburst was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Her tears, which had been long buried, now spilled over as she confronted a past that had never truly stayed buried. The high society dinner that had once been filled with whispered deals and covert power moves now turned into an arena of speculation and confusion. Lisa stood there, bewildered, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had never known of Grace's daughter, Isabella, but the emotional breakdown that followed told her this was no small matter. Grace's voice cracked as she called for answers, her eyes still locked on the bracelet. The years of silence had come to an explosive end, and in that moment, the Vitti family's carefully maintained facade of power and control was shattered. Everyone in the room was waiting for Grace to speak again, for Lisa to explain, and for the truth to finally come to light. Grace's gaze softened as she held back her tears, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You don't know what this means. This is my daughter's. She disappeared all those years ago, and now." The room waited, breathless. Lisa, trembling with fear and confusion, found herself pulled into a past she never knew existed. What was her connection to the Vitti family? Lisa had thought her life was ordinary, unassuming, easy to hide in the background of Mafia family's opulent world. But now, in the wake of Grace's revelation, Lisa's reality was about to implode. Her ordinary life, her quiet existence, was about to unravel, because Grace's words would set in motion a truth that no one had seen coming. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy silence hanging over the guests like a storm about to break. Grace Vitti stood motionless, staring at the bracelet on Lisa's wrist, her hand trembling at her side. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time that evening, her carefully maintained composure cracked. The quiet sob she tried to hold back only made the moment more intense. Lisa stood frozen, heart pounding in her chest, as the older woman's words echoed through the room. "It's Isabella's." Grace's voice broke as she spoke the name of her daughter, the same name that had haunted her for years. Isabella, her only daughter, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and her absence had been a wound Grace never allowed to heal. To her, the bracelet was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a connection to the daughter she had lost. "She gave it to me. On my birthday," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper, still fixated on Lisa's wrist. "Isabella, she was my life. And now you're wearing it. How can this be?" Her words trailed off, and the guests around them watched, unsure of how to respond. The air thickened with confusion, but Grace seemed to care little about their stares. The once vibrant dinner party was now consumed by the drama unfolding before them. Waiters hovered nervously, unable to resume their duties, while the elite guests exchanged uncertain glances. All eyes were on Grace, who was lost in her grief, and on Lisa, who stood at the center of an unraveling mystery. Lisa's mind raced. She opened her mouth, but the words felt like they were caught in her throat. How could this be happening? She had never known the Vitti family personally. She was just a maid, an outsider. She had no connection to their wealth, their power, or their dark history. How could this bracelet mean anything to them? I don't understand," Lisa stammered, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. "I bought this from a thrift store. It's just a bracelet. I didn't know. It doesn't mean anything." She raised her hand slightly, almost as if to remove the bracelet, to distance herself from the situation. But Grace's eyes, wide with disbelief and mounting desperation, held her in place. "No." Grace's voice was sharp now, filled with raw emotion. "It does mean something. To me, to my daughter, to our family. You don't understand." She took a step toward Lisa, her eyes scanning the young woman's face, as though searching for some hidden truth she couldn't yet comprehend. Lisa stepped back instinctively, feeling the weight of Grace's gaze bearing down on her. She wasn't prepared for this, wasn't prepared to be thrust into something so personal. But the tension in the room was undeniable. Grace's breakdown was like an invisible force, pulling everyone into its orbit. As the silence stretched, the door to the grand hall opened with a sudden creak, and Vincente Vitti walked in. His presence was like a storm, calm on the outside, but dangerous beneath the surface. The Mafia boss was a man of few words, his expression usually inscrutable. But the moment he entered and saw his mother's distress, something flickered in his eyes, something vulnerable, something human. The room seemed to collectively breathe again as Vincente's sharp eyes scanned the scene before him. He moved toward the center of the room, his imposing figure cutting through the tension like a knife. He stood between Grace and Lisa, casting a shadow over the young maid. His gaze was cold, but there was an undertone of concern for his mother that he couldn't quite hide. What's going on here? Vincente's voice was low, but it carried across the room with authority. Grace, her face still streaked with tears, looked at her son with a mixture of disbelief and longing. Vincente, this girl, she's wearing Isabella's bracelet. My daughter's bracelet. Her words faltered, choked off by emotion. Vincente turned his gaze to Lisa, his sharp eyes scanning her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. You're telling me you have no idea what this means? No connection to the Vitti family? He asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. Lisa shook her head, trying to regain some semblance of control. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quietly. I don't have any connection to your family. I'm just a maid. The tension between them was palpable as Vincente stood there, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to dismiss this as some kind of misunderstanding, something that could easily be ignored. But his mother's raw emotional response left him uneasy. He looked at Grace, then back at Lisa, trying to make sense of the situation. I'll handle this, Vincente finally said, his voice colder now. Everyone, please return to your seats. He gave a sharp nod to the staff, who hesitated before continuing their duties. The guests slowly resumed their conversations, though the air still buzzed with curiosity and unease. Vincente's gaze softened for a moment as he turned to Lisa. You better start explaining, he said in a low voice, his words no longer a question, but a command. He wasn't sure what this all meant, but one thing was certain. There was something about Lisa that didn't add up. And the truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light. The silence in the room was thick as Vincente led Lisa and Grace to the private sitting area at the edge of the grand estate. The weight of the earlier confrontation hung in the air, but now it was just the three of them in this tense, dimly lit space. Grace, still visibly shaken, sat down first, her hands folded tightly in her lap as though trying to hold onto the last shreds of her composure. Vincente remained standing, his posture rigid, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes dark with suspicion. Lisa, feeling more out of place than ever, shifted uncomfortably, her mind racing. Every part of her wanted to deny any connection to the Vitti family. She had always been just a maid, a nameless face in the crowd. But the sight of Grace's tears, the pleading in her eyes, unsettled her. Finally, Grace broke the silence, her voice hoarse with emotion. You have to understand, she began, her gaze fixed on Lisa as if she were searching for something. Isabella, my daughter, she disappeared nearly 20 years ago. And her voice faltered, and she took a deep breath. I could never mourn her properly. The family, Vincente included, kept the disappearance a secret. We couldn't let anyone know. Not for my sake, not for Isabella's, but for the Vitti name. The Vitti family doesn't show weakness. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. A family secret, a tragedy that had been buried, hidden away from the world. The idea that the Vitti family had been willing to sacrifice Grace's pain for the sake of power sent a cold shiver down her spine. She was deeply involved with Vincente's future wife, Gianna. Grace continued, her eyes now distant, as if reliving the memories. They were inseparable, and that's what made it worse. Gianna was devastated by her disappearance. But the truth, the real truth, it was too dangerous to reveal. It would have exposed too many things about the Vitti family, things that no one was ready to face. Lisa's mind was whirling. She could hardly process the depth of what Grace was revealing, but something in her gut twisted uneasily. She had been raised in foster care, always told she was abandoned by her biological parents. The idea that she could have a mother, a family, this family, was beyond her understanding. I never had the chance to grieve her properly, Grace whispered, tears welling up again. And then, out of nowhere, here you are. You're wearing that bracelet, the same bracelet I gave Isabella. It's impossible to ignore the signs, Lisa. They say that what's lost can never be found, but I never believed that. I couldn't, until now. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Could it be true? Could she really be? Isabella's daughter? The notion seemed impossible, but as Grace's words sank in, a part of her that had always felt incomplete, the nagging sense that something vital was missing, began to make sense. Grace, Vincente said, his voice low and measured. This is absurd. We can't just jump to conclusions based on a bracelet. There's no proof. No one has seen Isabella in years. How can you be sure she's even alive? Grace's eyes hardened, and for the first time, she looked directly at Vincente with a gaze that could pierce steel. You don't understand, Vincente, she said, her voice trembling with both anger and grief. I've been searching for her for decades. There were whispers, rumors, things that never made it into the public eye. Isabella was close to Gianna. And Gianna, she stopped herself, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. Gianna was involved in things that could destroy everything we've built. Lisa turned to Vincente, her mind still reeling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was too big, too dangerous. Was this the life she was tied to? As Grace finished speaking, the room fell silent again, and Lisa felt a shift in the air, a sense of realization creeping in. She didn't just feel lost anymore. She felt like part of something much darker, more complicated. Grace turned to Lisa, her voice now softer, yet full of expectation. You don't remember anything, do you? Your real name, your parents, your bloodline. Grace reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on Lisa's. But when I look at you, I see her. I see Isabella's eyes in yours. It's impossible to ignore. Lisa's heart raced. She looked down at the bracelet again, the tiny golden charm gleaming as if it were beckoning her to step into a past she had never known. Is it possible? Lisa whispered, her voice shaky as she gazed back at Grace. Am I your granddaughter? For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the question hung in the air like a dark cloud, and in the stillness, Lisa's world seemed to crack open. Vincente's gaze flickered between them, but he remained silent. Grace, her eyes wide with hope and fear, nodded slowly. The implications of that nod were clear, and the truth, whatever it was, had just begun to unravel. The tension in the room was palpable as Vincente Vitti stood, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The grandiose, polished Vitti estate, which had always been a symbol of power and control, now felt stifling, like a cage closing in on all of them. He stared at Lisa, trying to make sense of what was unfolding, but his mind refused to accept the possibility of what Grace was suggesting. Grace, Vincente said coldly, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. You can't seriously be considering this. We don't know anything about her. This maid shows up out of nowhere, and you're telling me she's somehow connected to Isabella? My future wife's best friend, who vanished years ago. Grace's face had hardened, the years of grief and emotional walls breaking apart before her very eyes. She stood, eyes locked with Vincente's. Vincente, I've seen enough to know she's our blood. I don't need you to believe me right now, but I know. I know. Vincente turned away, pacing slightly, his mind a battlefield. The revelation had struck him hard, far harder than he'd care to admit. The Vitti family had built its empire on secrecy, on control. His mother had always been the anchor, quiet, calculating, ruthless. But the idea of Isabella's disappearance being connected to this young woman in front of him twisted his insides. His gaze returned to Lisa, a hard edge to his stare. So, tell me then, he said, narrowing his eyes, are you part of a plan? Were you sent here to get close to my family, to infiltrate us? Is this some kind of trap? The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Vincente had always been a man of control. But now, this maid, this woman he barely knew, was unraveling everything he thought he understood about loyalty. Lisa met his gaze without flinching, her jaw set, a fire burning behind her eyes. She was no longer the shy, invisible maid who had tiptoed around the Vitti family. You think I'm here to destroy your family? She asked, her voice calm yet firm. I've been cleaning your floors, serving your guests, blending into the background because that's all I've ever known. But now I know the truth, and that truth is that I'm connected to you, to your family, and I won't pretend I'm not anymore." Her words hit Vincente like a cold slap. He wanted to lash out, to call her bluff, but something in her steady demeanor told him she wasn't lying. For the first time in years, Vincente felt a flicker of doubt creep into his ironclad resolve. Could this woman, this stranger, really be the missing link to the past he'd buried so deeply? Grace, watching the exchange, felt a pang of guilt. She had always known the truth, but for months, she had kept it locked inside, unwilling to face it. She turned to Lisa, her voice softer now, filled with a sadness that only a mother could know. I knew months ago, but I couldn't bear the thought of confronting it, of confronting you. Losing Isabella was hard enough. I didn't want to lose you too, Lisa. But the truth is that you're my granddaughter, and I've spent all this time keeping that from you, from myself." A moment of quiet passed between them. Lisa's eyes softened as she looked at Grace, the woman who had lost so much. Her heart ached for Grace's pain, for the mother's heartbreak that had been hidden for so long. But the weight of the truth settled heavily on Lisa's chest. She was Isabella's daughter. She was family. Vincente, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of disbelief and growing unease, broke the silence. His voice was quieter now, tinged with the conflict he felt inside. "So what now, Lisa?" he asked, his eyes boring into hers. "What do you expect from me? You're telling me your blood, but what does that mean? You think you can just walk into this family and claim a seat at the table?" Lisa's heart raced, but she didn't back down. She had spent too many years invisible, too many years uncertain of who she truly was. "I'm not asking for a seat at your table," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm just asking for the truth. I'm not here to destabilize your empire, Vincente, but I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. I'm done hiding." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Vincente stared at her for a long moment, the gears of his mind turning, his thoughts battling against each other. On one hand, Lisa's bloodline could be the key to strengthening his family's legacy, something no one could dispute. But on the other, her sudden arrival, this truth, could mean vulnerability, a chink in the armor that had taken years to build. Grace watched her son carefully, the weight of her own grief threatening to overtake her once again. She had lived in the shadows of her own past for too long. The time had come to face it. "Vincente," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You have a choice now. Accept her. Accept your bloodline. Or continue hiding behind your power, afraid of what the truth might do. But the truth is here, and it will come for you, no matter what." Vincente looked from Grace to Lisa, and for the first time in his life, he questioned what his next move would be. Power, loyalty, blood, all of it was intertwined, and now he had to decide where he stood and who would stand with him. The morning light crept through the wide windows of the Vitti estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. In the heart of the drawing room, Grace Vitti sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale but resolute. Across from her stood Vincente, every line of his body tense. Lisa lingered near the doorway, uncertain, caught between the past that haunted them and the future that demanded a choice. For days, none of them had spoken of what happened. The truth, Lisa's bloodline, the connection to Isabella, had cracked open something deep within the Vitti family. What had once been whispered in the shadows was now laid bare. Grace could no longer carry the burden alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with sorrow. "Vincente," she began softly, "you've spent your entire life protecting this family's name. But there are things you don't understand. Things I kept from you about Isabella." Vincente turned to her, his expression guarded. "You mean the lies?" he said bitterly. "The secrets that nearly destroyed us." Grace didn't flinch. "The lies were mine to bear," she said. "I hid her, your sister, from everyone. I did it to protect her. Isabella was in danger. The enemies we made when your father was alive, they were closing in on us. I thought if she disappeared, she could live. I thought I was saving her. Lisa froze. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air tighter. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears, but she didn't stop. I told everyone she was gone. Grace continued, her voice breaking. I buried an empty coffin and wore black for years. But I couldn't tell the truth, not even to you. If anyone had known she was still alive, they would have hunted her. So I let the world believe she was dead. Even you, Vincente. The weight of her confession fell hard. Vincente's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You let me mourn my sister, he said, his voice sharp with restrained fury. You let me build this family on a lie. I did what I had to do, Grace whispered. And I have lived with that guilt every single day. But it's over now. Lisa is her daughter, your niece. She is our blood. You can keep living in denial, Vincente, or you can end this cycle before it destroys us all. The silence that followed was unbearable. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Vincente, the powerful Mafia boss, her uncle, struggling between rage, pride, and something else. Something softer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. You want me to bring her into this life? Into this world of blood and betrayal? You think that's what Isabella would have wanted? No, Grace said quietly. But she deserves to know where she came from. You both do. And maybe, just maybe, it's time this family stopped living in the shadows. Vincente looked at Lisa. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a slow, resigned sigh, he stepped forward. If you are who my mother says you are, he said, his voice steady now, then you carry the Vitti blood. That means you share in both the power and the burden. There's no turning back. Lisa met his gaze without fear. I understand, she said. I didn't ask for this life, but I won't run from it. Vincente studied her a moment longer, then nodded. Then welcome to the family. Months passed, and the Vitti empire adapted to its new reality. Lisa's presence brought change. Unexpected, swift, and undeniable. She was no longer the quiet maid who blended into the wallpaper. Under Vincente's watchful eye, she learned the intricacies of the family business, the deals, the loyalties, the betrayals. Grace watched her transform with both pride and sadness. The girl who had stumbled into their world had become a woman of steel, cunning, and composed. Yet, for all the strength she displayed, Lisa never lost the small trace of warmth she'd inherited from her mother. It was what set her apart in a world where mercy was weakness. She became Vincente's most trusted confidant, his reminder that family was more than just power. It was blood, history, and redemption. In her final years, Grace found a fragile peace. She would sit on the terrace at sunset, the same place where she had once wept for Isabella, now watching her granddaughter shape the family's future. The guilt never left her entirely, but it no longer ruled her. Lisa visited often, and they spoke little of the past. Their bond didn't need words. It was built on understanding and shared loss. When Grace finally passed, the Vitti estate fell silent once more. Lisa stood beside Vincente as they laid her to rest, the matriarch who had carried the family's sins now gone. The legacy she left behind was complicated, blood-stained, but unbroken. Lisa glanced at Vincente as they stood by the grave. She saved us, she said softly. Vincente nodded. She saved what was left. And as the sun set over the Vitti estate, the cycle of secrecy ended. Not with vengeance, but with truth. The Vitti name would live on, reshaped by the woman who once served in silence and now led with strength.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and be part of a community that cherishes unforgettable tales like this one. Your support means more than you know. It fuels the creation of even more stories that speak to the heart. So, whether you're watching from your TV or your phone, take a moment to join us. Every like, every subscription, every share helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Thank you for being a part of this journey.